Well, good morning. This is Keith Ayers from Integro Leadership Institute in Sydney, Australia. I realise for most of you attending this webinar, you're in the United States, so it's good afternoon or good evening for you. Thank you for joining me today. This is the second of a three-part webinar series that we're doing on creating a culture of belonging and inclusion. In the first webinar, which was about a few weeks ago, we did talk about how do you create a high-performing culture, right? And of course, how belonging and inclusion contribute to creating that culture where you can achieve high levels of organizational performance. And so in this webinar, we're going to focus on the leader's role in creating that culture and what leaders need to do to transform the culture to one that is high performing and basically founded on belonging and inclusion. But before we get started, I've got some numbers here from a Harvard Business Review research study that was done in late 2019. And I did quote from this in the previous webinar, but what I wanted to share with you this time was the actual benefits for organizations who do create this culture. First of all, a 56% increase in job performance. Secondly, a 50% drop in turnover, that's employee turnover or turnover risk, and a 75% reduction in sick days, okay? And so that's pretty substantial increases in organizational performance, isn't it? And significant savings on the bottom line. And the other thing, of course, it's important to recognize here that this is pre-COVID, all right? Also in that same research study from Harvard, they mentioned that despite $8 billion a year being spent by organizations in the US on training in diversity and inclusion, over 40% of the people that they surveyed said that they still felt isolated. Now that's before COVID. I wonder how many would be feeling more isolated today. Interesting, isn't it? So what do we need to do? Now, in the last session, I also introduced you to the passion pyramid. And we're talking employee passion here. And this is based on research that I did some years ago to identify what are the needs that employees have that if we satisfy will result in passionate employees, and not just people who are passionate about what they do, the work that they do, but also passionate about the organization they work for. And so out of that research came these 5 needs. And I put it in a pyramid because they actually build on each other, all right? And so we have to start with the need to be respected, right? Because if employees don't feel that they're respected, then they don't really want to learn and grow from a leader who doesn't respect them, right? And they certainly don't want to be an insider with someone that they don't feel respects them either, all right? And so on. So we need to satisfy all of these needs. And then on the left-hand side of the model, we have the leadership skills that I've identified that satisfy these needs. And then on the right-hand side, the outcomes or the payoff for the organization when the need is satisfied. So I'm not going to go into detail on this because I did cover it quite a bit last time, but I do want to make a point here, and I brought up this point earlier in the previous session, is that we're talking about belonging and inclusion, and the need to be an insider fits right into that space, doesn't it? Insider status, that I'm on the same team as my manager, and the kinds of things that people need in order to feel like they're an insider is to be included in conversations, be included in problem solving, being included in decision making, all right? And so obviously leaders need to be inclusive if they're going to create or satisfy that need for people. But I made the point before as well, and I'm going to reiterate it now, and that is that if we just focus on trying to help people feel like they're an insider, but we don't treat them with respect, or they don't feel like they are really respected, we don't give them the opportunities to learn and grow, then I don't think that need to be an insider is going to be satisfied. And maybe that's why 40% of people who responded to the survey said they still felt isolated. All right. So we'll come back to this a bit later as well. The other thing that came out of this research was because when we survey employees in organizations to measure the culture and how healthy the culture is, one of the things we're measuring is these, let me just go back to this for a moment, is these 5 needs. And we have 2 items that measure each of these 5 needs, so 10 items. And we have 2 questions we ask them. How important is this need to you personally? And secondly, how well is the need being satisfied? All right. And both of those are measured on a 10-point scale, where 10 is extremely high or extremely satisfied. Okay. And so with 10 items, 10-point scale, the maximum score an employee can give the organization in terms of importance of these needs is 100. Okay. And so when we look at all the data we've collected here, there's an average score of 90 out of 100 for over 6,000 employees that we've surveyed. All right. In other words, these needs are important to everybody. And if you don't satisfy them, passion will be down. Okay. Of course, we also ask them how well is it being satisfied on a 10-point scale, and then we can measure the gap. Okay. So what happens when we satisfy these needs is that there's a high level of trust. We're going to look at the trust model a little later again, but we also ask employees the degree to which these values that build trust are important to them, and the degree to which their organization operates by the values that build trust. All right. And the bigger the gap, the lower the trust level. And so what our data tells us is if we satisfy these 5 needs, then we end up with a very high level of trust. There's a strong, very strong correlation between the two. We've never had an organization where the needs are satisfied and there's low trust, or where the needs are not satisfied and there's high trust. It just doesn't happen. Now, the other thing we measure, as we talked about in the last session too, was how passionate people are about what they do and about the organization they work for. All right. And again, strong correlation. When the high need satisfaction, then there's high trust, we have very high levels of passion for both the job and the organization. Okay. And that, of course, means you would have very high levels of engagement. Okay. So that's the chain reaction. And it really all starts with these needs. Okay. And so we're focusing on the leader this time and looking at what the leaders can do to satisfy these needs. And so let's move on to what kind of leadership will create a culture of belonging and inclusion. All right. I'm going to start with the definition of flexibility, which you might think is a strange place to start, but it's actually an important place to start, because our definition of flexibility is the ability to relate to people in such a way that their needs are at least as important as yours. All right. Now, if you think about that, you think about people that you work with, the people that you live with. All right. If you've worked with or lived with somebody who was more interested in their own needs than your needs, you pick that up pretty quickly, don't you? All right. You know that. And maybe you get known it for some time and you'd like to have them focus more on your needs, but you stay in there and you work with this person or you live with this person, but there's still this sense of they're not very flexible. All right. Why? Because they're focused on their own needs. All right. And not focused on others' needs. Now, if we're going to satisfy the needs that ignite passion and create a culture where people are passionate about what they do and about the organization, then we need to satisfy those needs. So the leader needs to be focused on satisfying those needs. Okay. And for leaders to do that, it doesn't necessarily come naturally. Okay. Because it requires both mental and behavioral agility. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And we call this webinar Transforming Culture with Agile Leadership. All right, but there's 2 kinds of agility needed here. First of all, consciously, mentally, I need to be thinking about what other people's needs are. All right, and investigating perhaps what their needs are. I also need to be behaviorally agile. That is, I need to adapt my behavior to ensure that I'm satisfying those needs. All right. That's a different skill to mental agility. All right. And so being aware of this, having the consciousness that says, okay, I need to focus on this and I need to learn to adapt. I need to stretch myself and perhaps stretch myself outside my comfort zone. Okay. Now, there's one thing that can get in the road of us being able to do that well. And I'm going to introduce you to a model which we call the change cycles. All right. And this model was created in this particular form by Dr. Ralph Colby, who was one of the founders of my company, Integro. And he had a knack for coming up with conceptual models that made it easy to understand things that could be complex. All right. So the change cycles is looking at how people react to change. All right. Now you'll see in the middle of the model there, I've got change and problem. Okay. The reason for that is oftentimes the first time we realize that something has changed is when there's a problem. Everything was going smoothly. Now we've got a problem. What happened? Okay. The other reason that them together there is that therefore people will tend to react to both change and problems in the same way. They see them as sort of the same thing. Okay. And you'll see at the bottom we have maintenance cycle, and at the top we have growth cycle. So there's two ways in which we can react to change. Okay. And so we're going to deal with the maintenance cycle first. And maintenance cycle would indicate that we want to maintain things the way they are. We want the change to go away. We want the problem to go away, right? And so the attitude that people have when they go into what we call a maintenance cycle is that they see change as a threat. Their attitude is that it's a threat. It's bad. This is negative, okay? And so the reaction in terms of behavior is to be defensive, okay? Now, when I learned this, we talked about fight or flight behavior. And in fact, this is the survival instinct, isn't it? Okay. When we see something as a threat, we want to defend ourselves. So we react in fight or flight. And in more recent years, we've added freeze to that. Okay. And so this is an emotional state. When you go in a maintenance cycle, and you do, because we all do, it's a natural instinct for all human beings. All right. And we just react when we feel threatened. So we'll look at the neuroscience connection with that in just a moment. And so it's something that we all do. And we naturally go into this behavior, right? This fight or flight or freeze behavior, okay? And what we're trying to do is prevent the change or problem from adversely affecting us or hoping it will go away, okay? And so where's our focus? Our focus is internal on me, all right? So when I'm in a maintenance cycle, I'm not going to be flexible. I'm not looking at what other people's needs are. I'm looking at my needs and looking at my thoughts and feelings and what I believe is right and wrong, what we should or shouldn't do, or what I should or shouldn't do, okay? And so if I'm going to be flexible as a leader and focus on other needs, I need to stay out of or get out of this maintenance cycle, all right? And the way to do that is to see change or problems as an opportunity. And then my behavior will be constructive, all right? So what I've learned to do, the way I've learned to do this is when I find myself feeling threatened and I feel myself being sucked into this negative emotional state, is to say, whoa, hang on a second. And I like to imagine that I've got a little light switch in my forehead, all right? And I can just flick the switch over and jump into a growth cycle by asking myself, what can I learn from this? Or what's the opportunity here? And start switching into those constructive behaviors, like asking questions, by investigating things, by listening, by maybe making some suggestions, right? So what we would call growth cycle behaviors, okay? And so the key for leaders to be more flexible and therefore be able to see what other people's needs are and satisfy other people's needs, they need to spend more time in a growth cycle than in a maintenance cycle. To do that, they've got to be aware that when they go into maintenance cycle, to switch themselves out of that, okay? And to have that awareness. That's what I love about the models that Ralph created, and I particularly love this model because when people have seen this, anytime they go into a maintenance cycle after that, they're going to be reminded, oh, God, I'm in a maintenance cycle. Okay, maybe I need to ask myself the question, what can I learn from this situation? All right, even it could be a really bad situation. But the sooner we can get into what can we learn from this, how can we recover from this, we start focusing outwardly rather than inwardly on what's going on inside me. Okay, and so that's the change cycle model as Ralph taught it to me 44 years ago when I first joined Integro, right? And I've been teaching it pretty much the same way ever since, because it's still valid in today's world, right? People are still doing both, and people can benefit from understanding what's going on psychologically for them when they're reacting defensively, and how they can move from that into a growth cycle. Now, in more recent years, we've added some different language to the conversation around this kind of thing, and I'm sure you're more familiar with the fixed mindset, growth mindset. And there's a lot of models around that, but it fits nicely here on top of our change cycles. All right, and so to get out of a maintenance cycle, I've got to be mentally agile. All right, I've got to be aware that I'm in one, and switch my thinking to, hang on a sec, what can I learn from this? And then I need to adapt my behavior from being defensive to being constructive, and so to be behaviorally agile as well. Okay, so the neuroscience, I think it makes sense to have a look at that. All right, because we're all learning about this, and maybe some of you studied it way more than I have. But we all know that the, let me put the change cycle model up here, okay? The way we perceive change or problems is different, all right? I'm going to introduce how DISC fits with that in just a moment, and I think a lot of you are familiar with the DISC model. That people with different behavioral styles or different personalities have different needs and fears, and so they see things differently, they interpret things differently, all right? And the long-term memory stuff, say the hippocampus, for example, is where that memory might be stored, and it's, so I look at something in a certain way, and I see that as a threat, and someone else working next to me doesn't see it as a threat at all, right? Different programming, okay? And so, but if I see it as a threat, that's what triggers off the amygdala, okay? To react and punch out these emotions, and particularly fear, okay? And if I'm going to get into a growth cycle, I've got to mentally switch to the prefrontal cortex, okay? And be aware of my emotions, be aware of the feelings that are being triggered, but look at things differently and then learn to adapt. Okay, so DISC, if you are familiar with it, each of the styles has a different fear, all right? So if you've got a fear of loss of control, your amygdala is going to fire off some fear emotion if someone takes control of a situation that you're in control of, wants to overtake control from you. Okay, and an S-style person is going to trigger a fear if they say something and suddenly think, oh, I hope I didn't hurt their feelings, okay, and start worrying about it, okay? So that's going to trigger us into the fixed mindset or maintenance cycle, where we're focused on our needs rather than the needs of others around us, okay? All right, so back to the definition of flexibility, all right? Just to remind you, the ability to relate to people in such a way that their needs are at least as important as yours. And what we're going to examine is how important this is in creating that culture of belonging and inclusion, and what leadership behaviors are going to help us do that, and how can we help leaders measure that, okay? So I came up with a few examples of behavioral agility that you might be able to relate to, where there's a need for behavioral agility. Okay, and I've sort of tied in this with DISC a little bit. I haven't spelt out the DISC bit, but for example, and this may be more prominent if you're a person who's strong in the dominance style, okay, the D. How do you stop yourself from interrupting the other person when you're feeling really impatient? Okay, that requires a fair bit of mental agility as well as behavioral agility, right? And then listening to other people's opinions when you know you've got the right path to take. And they don't know what they're talking about, all right? Or asserting your opinions and standing your ground even when you know it could cause conflict. And I'm an SI style in DISC, so you know that's something that I'm very conscious of, all right? I need to stand my ground. I need to stand up to opposition here, but it's going to cause an argument, or it's going to cause some conflict. Okay, and then the last one is setting aside your sense of urgency to consider others' feelings and needs. All right, now when you really need to get something done, and it's very important, and other people are asking things of you. Okay, I'm sure we can all relate to times when we've had to do that. All right, so to go from agility to flexibility, I've said already, flexibility requires both mental and behavioral agility, and it starts with being open to change and open to learning. All right, growth cycle, growth mindset. The difficult part for most leaders is adapting their behavior, being more versatile and able to use a wide range of behaviors depending on the needs of the situation. But you're not going to do that if you haven't adapted your thinking, if you haven't been mentally agile, if you haven't switched to a growth cycle. Okay, and so how can you increase this interpersonal flexibility in leaders? Okay, well, we've got an assessment that we've developed to use that. The origins of this go right back to Ralph Colby, and I got my flexibility measured back in 1977 when I joined Integra, and I've been measuring thousands of leaders' flexibility since. So it's been around for a long time, but we brought it a long way. But one of the things that we identified, first of all, was to assess what level of flexibility a leader is at. Okay, and Ralph came up with the word endorsement, which I hadn't used much before. But if you think about it, if being flexible is not about making people happy, it's not about just satisfying people's needs, although that's a part of it. We need to do that in order to gain people's endorsement. All right, and that's not necessarily support, although that would be part of it. All right, we need them to endorse what we want them to do. It's like when you go to vote in an election, you endorse a person or a party or whatever. Okay, you might not necessarily like them, but you give them your endorsement. So if you're going to be an effective leader, you need broad endorsement. You need to get endorsement from everyone on your team. Right? You need endorsement from a broad range of people, not just in your team, other people in the organization, etc. Okay, so we measure what level leaders are perceived to be by other people, right? And the reason is that you can't measure your own flexibility effectively because you're focused internally a lot of the time. Okay, other people perceive how flexible you are based on their observation of you. All right, so when people take this assessment, they get from 5 to 7 or 8 people to complete the assessment on them. There isn't any limit, you can have more than that, but and this is what the overall flexibility rating would look like. Okay, so in this case we have a person who rated themselves at level 4, broad endorsement, but others rated them a 3, high moderate endorsement. Okay, it's not uncommon for people to rate themselves higher than others. And I've seen people who rated themselves a 4 and others rated them a 1. All right, talk about a lack of self-awareness. All right, in terms of how they're perceived by other people. All right, and so one of the things after measuring flexibility for all those years, only about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I had collected a lot of data and I sent it off to a psychometrician at the university in Melbourne to ask them to just analyze the data and give us a psychometric report on what the data was telling us. All right, and interestingly enough, we found there were 3 subscales behind flexibility. All right, and they were interpersonal warmth, the degree to which people find you approachable. All right, now you think about that. If you're going to go and talk to somebody, and you want someone who's flexible, who's going to be interested in your needs and listen to what you want to do or what you want to say, it would be good if they were approachable, wouldn't it? Right, and easy to work with. Okay. Second one is understanding, and so we're talking about mutual understanding here. That is, that you understand that flexible leader that you want to go and talk to, and you know that they understand you. All right, so that puts people at ease. Okay, and then thirdly, encouragement, interpersonal encouragement. the degree to which people find you free with praise and encouragement, okay? And so again, for each of those, we have 4 levels. And it's possible, as you can see in this particular example here, we've got different ratings in different subscales. So this particular leader, others perceive them as only level 2 in understanding, but level 3 in warmth and encouragement, okay? And sometimes there's a bigger difference in that, and it could be that actually a leader might be pretty good on the warmth side and the understanding side, but they don't do much encouraging, okay? Well, that's going to limit their effectiveness in gaining endorsement from other people, all right? And it also helps for the leader to be able to dissect this a little bit more and know specifically what areas do I need to work on to increase my flexibility and my ability to transform the culture, okay? So just a quick look at some of the items that we're using to measure this, and also a resource that we have that can help leaders to increase their flexibility. So in the area of interpersonal warmth, there are, for each of the 3 subscales, there are 5 items, 5 behaviors that we're measuring. And on each of these, we've got a 6-point scale, all right? We chose a 6-point scale because we didn't want people choosing the middle option. And it's from almost never to almost always, basically, okay? So are you approachable, cooperative, tolerant, adaptable, and flexible, all right? And then for each of these 5 behaviors, in fact, for each of the 15 behaviors we're using to measure the 3 subscales, we have development notes, all right? And so in this case, we've chosen flexible. And if someone has not scored high on flexible, that is they're not up at the almost always, or even maybe there are 3 or 4 out of 6 on flexible, then here are some desired behaviors. These are things that flexible leaders do, okay? And then on the understanding side, obviously, different behaviors we're measuring here. And as you can see, some interesting ones, they're behaving appropriately, okay? That indicates someone who's being aware or is aware of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, right? They're looking at what's going on around them. They're thinking about the culture here and what are the norms here, okay? So as well as believable, I think is a good question too. So, and then encouragement, all right? And one of the ones that people sometimes struggle with is comforting. Right? They might be good at giving praise and encouraging people, but they're not necessarily comforting when people are needing some comfort. All right, that's a really interesting one. Anyway, so back to the chain reaction and the needs that ignite passion from the pyramid, okay? Just to remind you that when leaders focus on satisfying those needs, they increase trust, right? There's a very strong correlation between the two. It makes sense. If someone satisfies your needs, you're more likely going to be trusting them as well, right? Okay, and that increases passion, which increases engagement. All right. Now, the other thing that we have in this assessment that we're measuring leadership effectiveness is not just flexibility, but also trust building ability. All right. And we put they're 2 separate sections and we report on them separately. So different items. And we put them together back in 2009 when we first created this version of the survey. Because we felt that there'd be a very strong correlation between flexibility and trust. In other words, if you want to build a high level of trust with people, you need to be flexible. You need to focus on their needs. Now, we've got other research that confirms that, of course, but our research with this particular survey has reinforced this. Now, if you were on the webinar a couple of weeks ago, you would have seen the Integra Trust Model, and I'm just going to go through it again because this is what we're measuring now at that leadership level, all right? And this is as perceived by their direct reports, or if they're members of a leadership team, then team members would be assessing each other in terms of their flexibility and trust building ability, okay? And so these 4 behaviors, these are the behaviors that build trust. And again, this is a conceptual model that was created by Dr. Ralph Colby, all right? And this is the reason I joined Integra. When I saw this model, I went, oh my God, every organization needs this, right? And so it resonated with me very strongly, and so the 4 behaviors are acceptance, who you are is okay with me, that is being non-judgmental, openness, And that's two-way. I give and ask for feedback freely. I share information freely, but I also want to know what your information is. I share my opinions. I want to know what your opinion is. All right. It's got to be two-way. Congruence, or congruence, as I think you would call it. What I say is what I mean. Congruent triangles are triangles that have the same angles. They're the same shape. They could be different sizes. Okay. So congruence means the same as. What I say is the same as what I really mean. In other words, I'm telling the truth. I'm telling you what I really believe. Okay. And I think the most common expression I've heard when in America is walking the talk. Okay. That would be congruence. And then reliability is the last, but not necessarily least. It's not in that order for a particular reason, other than some research that we've done. But that's the most obvious one. I do what I say I'll do. You can count on me. Okay. Now, what we found through our research is that, yes, people focus most on reliability. Organizations focus on reliability. They expect people to do their jobs and do it well. All right. People who buy from companies expect the product or service that they buy to be what the value promise, right? To deliver on the value promise. Okay. So reliability is extremely important. But what we found is that when there's a lack of congruence, people don't tell the truth, or don't say what they really mean, or don't confront the brutal facts, as Jim Collins said in Good to Great, then reliability goes down. And when there's a lack of openness, people hold back on being congruent. And when there's a lack of acceptance, people hold back on being open. So all four of these behaviors are important to build strong trust relationships. And if you think about someone that you've got a very strong trust relationship with, I'm sure you can look at those four behaviors and say, yep, they're all there. All right. And if you think about someone that the trust relationship isn't where you want it to be, you can go, yep, that one's not there, or not nearly enough of it. All right. And there may be more than one, right? But it could only be one, because one of these not being there to the degree that you really want in order to be able to trust that person is going to diminish trust. Okay. So these are the four behaviors to build trust. 2007, I added another layer to this. And the reason I did was because I'd been working with this for 30 years and people were saying what a fantastic model, wish everyone would do this. But then they would turn around and withhold information from people or judge somebody, right? And because these behaviors are not necessarily easy to do, all right? How do you accept someone who's irritating you? Okay. Difficult, isn't it? How can you be non-judgmental? All right. Well, you can, but we need to drop back to the values that drive the behaviors. And so if someone's irritating me and I really need to let them know that I really do accept them, I've got to drop back and say, well, what do I respect about this person? I've got to believe it's important to respect people and believe that they deserve recognition in order to behave in an accepting way. So when this person is irritating me, I step back and say, well, hang on, what do I really respect about this person? Yeah, that behavior might be irritating, but what do I really respect about them? And what have they done, or what are they doing that really I do appreciate? Okay, now I'm going to let them know that I respect them. I'll let them know that I really appreciate what they've done, and they're feeling accepted. And so trust is developing. Okay, so the two values that drive openness are receptivity and disclosure. So when would I want to do this? Drop back to the values when I'm struggling with openness, when I'm feeling like I don't really want to share this information, even though I know they want this information. Okay, well, I may not be 100% sure that it's 100% right, but I know that disclosure is really important to them, and I need to believe that it's important to disclose information. I can disclose that I'm not sure it's 100% right yet. Okay, but I can be open with that. And I need to be open to what you've got to say too. I need to believe it's important to listen to what you've got to say. Now, some people are good at disclosure, but not receptivity, and vice versa. Okay, we need both if we're going to have a truly open relationship. Okay, congruence. Two values are straightforwardness and honesty. If I'm going to say what I mean and mean what I say, I've got to believe it's important to be straightforward. And if you're an S-style like me, saying what you mean and meaning what you say could be difficult because you might upset someone and they mightn't like what you've got to say. And so in those situations when I really need to be straight with you, I've got to drop back to the value and say, Keith, it's really important to be straightforward here. And it's uncomfortable. My gut's churning a bit, but I've just got to spit it out. Okay. Honesty here is about being honest and ethical, all right, and practicing what I preach. If I got some values on a plaque on the wall, am I congruent with those? Am I practicing what we're preaching here? Okay, and so, and then the last one, reliability. The two values we identified were to keep commitments and seek excellence. In other words, if I struggled with reliability, and some people do, and if we know DISC, we know maybe some people who overcommit themselves, take on too much, haven't run out of time to do everything. They need to be more precious with their commitments, right? They need to believe it's important to keep every commitment they make. And so before making a commitment, stop and think, can I really do this? Do I have the time to do this? And do I have the time to do it well? Okay. And then seeking excellence is doing the best every time. And you know the people you can rely on the most are those who keep their commitments, do what they say they'll do, but they also do their best. They never give you half a job. Okay. So that's the outer circle of the values that build trust. And that's what we're actually measuring in these leaders who are taking the assessment on flexibility and trust building ability. Okay. To what degree are they perceived as operating by these 8 values that build trust? To what degree are they respectful, give recognition, receptive, disclosing, etc.? Okay, and we've identified 2 items that measure each of those 8 values. So there's 16 items in this part of the survey. And again, on a 6-point scale from almost never to almost always. Okay. Now, after collecting about 17,000 surveys, I sent this off to the psychometrician as well and said, just have a look at this. Is there anything here that we can learn from? And sure enough, like we had 3 subscales for flexibility, we found 2 subscales behind the trust model. All right. And I wasn't that keen on adding another layer, but this actually added something really useful, because we can see that the 4 values on the upper right side of this model are about communication. Do I communicate with respect? Do I communicate recognition or appreciation? Do I listen? And do I speak up and say what's on my mind? Okay. But the others are focused more on consistency. Do I consistently tell it how it really is? Am I consistently honest, keep my commitments, do my best? Okay. And this became significant because at the time, I was working a lot with organizations on improving their culture and measuring the trust level at an organizational level, which we talked about in the last session. And we often had leaders in organizations saying, why do people score us low on trust for senior management, right? I don't understand that. We're honest, ethical, we're running a great organization and we're doing the right thing, we're achieving great results and all that kind of thing, all right? And then when you look at the consistency side, that's where their focus is, right? Senior management, organizations, strategic level are focused on delivering results, reliability, being honest and ethical, telling it how it really is, right? And that's what leaders see themselves as needing to do to be trustworthy. But when you ask the employees, what do you need from your leaders in order to trust them? And of course they expect the consistency side, but what they really want is respect, and they want recognition, and they want you to listen to them. They want you to be open with what's really going on, all right? So that's the trust divide in the corporate world, okay? Employees, if they're not getting that communication stuff, and honestly, a lot of senior executives I've run into are not good at that at all, don't place high importance on it, then you can expect you're going to get low scores on trust for senior management, okay? So back to the leader creating this culture, transforming the culture. If I'm going to build trust, I need to use all 8 values. And so we asked 2 questions about each of the 8, as I've said. And this is what the initial graph looks like. The dots represent the leader's self-perception. All right. And as you can see, this leader scored themselves higher than their direct reports have on everything except straightforwardness. Okay. And then we break that out to get more specific with the numbers on a 6-point scale, and the gray bars represent the self-perception and the colored bars represent the observer's perceptions, all right? And then we can drill down further to the actual items themselves. But the other thing we did here was, since we're measuring level of flexibility in the first section, we wanted to measure trust building ability in the same way. So we have the overall level of trust building skill. And again, 4 points, 4 quadrants. And I don't think I said this earlier in the flexibility piece, but how we determine what quadrant someone is in is based on what quartile they fall in against all of the leaders who've taken this assessment. Okay, and so if you're in the top quartile, that means you're in the top 25% of leaders as perceived by others in terms of trust building ability. Okay, and if this person here is in the second quartile, they're in the bottom 50%. Okay, so a lot of room for improvement there. Now you'll see the score ranges at the bottom there, and there's a pretty big gap between 16 and 67 at level 1. In other words, you've got to go a fair way towards building trust with people before they even notice that you're doing it. Likewise with flexibility. If you're sort of only part way along the line to putting other people's needs as at least as important as yours, people can see that. All right. We also then break that down into the 2 subscales. Okay. And again, this is because we find that people may be stronger in the communication side than they are in the consistency side. And if I just duck back to the trust model for a second, okay, and the reason is that the D and the C styles in DISC, who are more task-oriented, place more importance on reliability and congruence than they do on acceptance and openness. And the I and the S styles in DISC place far more importance on acceptance and openness than they do on the reliability congruence piece. Not necessarily more so than on congruence, but certainly much higher importance on those 2, and therefore probably better at it. So that could show up when we look at the 2 subscales here. Okay. All right. So just to wrap up here, and we will look at some key points. All right. That using the flexibility and trust survey, which is what we call this assessment, to transform organizational culture. Okay, so leaders can have very different personalities, as we know, different skills, different levels of emotional intelligence, different emotional intelligence skills, all of which have an impact on the culture they create, how people feel about coming to work. I quoted last time from the book, It's the Manager, Gallup's most recent book. And years of research, 70% of the variance in engagement scores in organizations are directly impacted by the immediate manager, right? So how people feel about coming to work, okay? So that's a factor, obviously, but my experience is that those leaders who have the most negative impact on culture are unaware of the impact they're having and how destructive their behavior can be, all right? Why is that? They're focused on themselves, all right? So behavioral style may be a factor, but the most likely cause of their intransigence is their lack of flexibility caused by their belief that their needs are more important than other people's needs. I've had many people over the years who I've given a report to that shows them as being seen as very low flexibility, like level 1 flexibility, limited endorsement, all right? The most automatic reaction is for the person to go into what we call a maintenance cycle, or the fixed mindset, and start defending themselves, rationalizing, explaining why it's wrong, okay? Of course, all that's doing is proving the result to be correct, isn't it? All right. In fact, I did have a partner from a big 5 accounting firm in a group session where I'd handed out their reports, and he came up with a level 2. And he put his hand up, and I said yes. He stood up and he started explaining why his report wasn't correct. And halfway through his sentence, he suddenly realized what he was doing. And he just went red in the face and sat down. And of course, everyone started laughing because he realized he was just proving the report was correct. Okay. Now, I've used the word intransigence there because I like it. And what it means is unwilling or refusing to change one's views or to agree about something. All right. I'm sure you have worked with people like that, maybe on some things, but some people are like that on a lot of things. Some people are untrainable, as in they don't think they need to learn anything. I'm just fine. Uncoachable, I don't need to be coached, or if you insist on coaching, I'm going to go through the motions, but I'm not really going to change anything. All right, and that's a real issue, isn't it? So that's going to impact on the culture. So the flexibility and trust survey is a powerful wake-up call for leaders to understand the impact their behaviour is having on the culture, the level of trust, and the degree to which colleagues feel included. Okay, and the thing that's the wake-up call here is because the strong correlation between flexibility and trust building ability, you may get those intransigent people who say, yeah, you're damn right, I am inflexible, right? And I'm proud of it because people know where they stand with me, all right? And then I would ask them the question, how do you feel about people not trusting you? What do you mean they don't trust me, all right? And that's going to show up in the survey, all right? Because there's never been a leader with a high level of flexibility and a low level of trust building ability, or a leader with a low level of flexibility and a high level of trust building ability. The correlation is extremely strong between the two sections. Okay, and then lastly here, understanding that seeing others' needs as at least as important as your own is the essential first step to creating a culture of belonging and inclusion. We have to be focused on their needs, all right? And if you want to be a little more specific about what those needs are, we've got this great model, all right? We've got heaps of data, right, that says these needs are important to everybody. Average score of 90 out of 100 across all employees surveyed for how important these needs are, okay? And it's the same every organization, right? So that we go into, we know that we're going to get those scores. All right, so lastly is the employee passion survey is the tool that we use to measure employee culture, and the tie-in between that and belonging and inclusion is very strong because we're measuring those needs that ignite passion and we're measuring the trust level in the organization, both of which are very important in creating that culture of belonging and inclusion. And so the actual employee passion survey is providing leaders with feedback about the impact their behavior is having on their team members, on their direct reports, and the culture that they're creating. So it's the impact of the behavior. We're not actually describing the behavior, we're describing the impact it's having on the employees. Do they feel included? Do they feel isolated? And so, and they're responding to questions about the needs relate to that. The FTS, Flexibility and Trust Survey, provides leaders with feedback about how they're actually behaving in both interpersonal flexibility and trust building ability. So then we can make connections between how I'm actually behaving and the impact I'm having on the culture, all right? Now, if you're using engagement surveys, which I'm assuming you all are, your engagement surveys should be providing you with feedback about the impact leaders' behavior is having on the culture and people's levels of engagement, all right? As Gallup's at 70% is coming from that immediate manager or supervisor, okay? So what behaviors are contributing to that? And this is specifically focused on flexibility and trust building ability. And of course, from there, we can establish clear action plans for people to increase flexibility, increase trust building ability, and create that culture where everybody feels included and truly belongs. Okay, so thank you very much for attending today. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you again for the third in this series. In the meantime, if you have any questions or would like further information, please contact the Certified Integro Associate who invited you to attend this webinar. And they have all been trained by me in the use of these assessments and can certainly help you. And I'm always supporting them in the background and ongoing help if they need it from me. Okay, so thanks for coming, and hopefully see you on June 16th. Okay, so we've got a bit of time to answer some questions, and we've got a couple of questions that popped up in the Q&A here. And if you've got any other questions, if you would like to just type them in. First question is, how do you get leaders to be willing to do this kind of work? All right. Well, the kind of leaders who are going to be willing to do this work are the leaders who are flexible and have got a growth mindset and wanting to continuously learn. But usually I find that some data is helpful, right? So, for example, if engagement scores are not where you want them to be, that's feedback that something needs to change, all right? And as we talked about just a moment ago, we have our own employee passion survey that measures need satisfaction, trust, and employee passion. Is also a valuable tool for getting the attention of leaders who need to be more flexible and need to be more effective at building trust. Okay, so I think that's the key thing. We've got to have some kind of measure. One of the other things which was on the previous slide, I just sort of didn't mention it, but one of the things that my clients have found helpful is to establish KPIs for their department managers or business unit managers tied to the gap scores in the employee passion survey. So if there's low need satisfaction, they set a KPI that increases that, reduces the gap between importance and satisfaction. Likewise with trust. And when they can see that they're being rated against that, then they pay a lot more attention to it. Okay, so that's another way in which it can be done. Okay, the second question, can I speak a little more about the feedback raters? Can the FTS flexibility and trust survey be used with the leader who may not have direct reports? And how many raters are recommended to give feedback? We recommend a minimum 5. And yes, I've done it with 4, but I don't want to do it with 3 or less. And if it's only 2, it gets really tricky because you can have one that scored high, one that scored low, and you get an average, which means nothing, right? And of course, you need to be aware that different observers will rate them differently, of course, anyway. All right, so there might be a range of scores, and they can see the range of scores in their assessment results as well. There's no limit on the number. You can have 12, 15 if you wanted, but it's probably not worth going much beyond 7 or 8 in terms of the number. Okay, but they don't have to have direct reports. If they're in a leadership role and they are leading a leader in the sense that they're influencing people, and they maybe influence people in different areas of the organization, they're influential in meetings, and seeking to gain endorsement for proposals or ideas or things like that, plans, then it just could be anyone who sees them in that role. Okay, and the other one I did mention earlier was that we do use this also with teams, and I'll talk about that in the next session about building high performance teams. Because when you measure the level of alignment in a team and the level of trust in a team, different team members have a different impact on the trust level, right? And if there's low trust, there'll be low alignment. We'll see the research on that next time too. So if there's trust issues in the team, then what impact is each team member having on the trust level in the team? So how are their peers on the team perceiving their trust building ability? And so the FTS can be a very valuable tool also in terms of helping people to be more effective team members and contribute more effectively to trust and alignment in the team. The last question that's come up is when you say it's a 180-degree assessment versus the 360-degree assessment, what is the difference? And 180 is one direction, all right? So if it's being used with leaders as part of leadership development or coaching, and we would certainly strongly recommend coaching in conjunction with this, then we just want direct reports, right? Because it's about them leading their teams. And if they're part of a team like the executive team, and we're looking at what impact they're having on the trust level in the team, then it's their peers who are going to complete it. So it's 180 degree and unidirectional again. All right. The thing is with flexibility, and you know yourself, there's times that you will be very flexible about things, and there's other times where you don't want to be flexible at all. There's some people that you are very flexible with, and other people you don't want to be flexible with. I'm sure you don't really want to be flexible with someone who is not flexible with you. Like if they don't care about your needs, why would you care about theirs? All right. Now, there may be a reason why you should, but it's not easy to do that. Okay. So your flexibility, as perceived by others, can vary from group to group. And if we did a 360, it diverts people away from what we're trying to achieve with this. All right. So if a leader is rated by their peers in a 360-degree version of this as being highly flexible, but their direct reports say they're inflexible, they can say, oh, my peers think I'm fine. They just don't know what they're talking about, right? And they tend to dismiss the feedback. So that's the reason why we only use it in a unidirectional way. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. Great questions. And thanks for being here. And hope to see you on the 16th of June.